Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Gallery of Poisoners, 13 Classic Case Histories of Murder by Poisoning, by Adrian Vincent, narrated by Shaun Grindell. The Man Who Hanged Himself, Frederick Seddon, 1912. On the surface, the Seddon menage was one of those typical lower-middle-class households which were the backbone of Edwardian society. The paterfamilias, Frederick Henry Seddon, was an insurance agent, the district superintendent for the Islington branch of the London and Manchester Industrial Company, and was a man who had about him an insufferable air of rectitude, which he had no doubt acquired when he had been a chapel-goer and teacher. His wife, Mary Ann, was a weak-willed woman, who was completely subservient to her husband's tyrannical wishes, a not unusual situation in those days, when the idea of women's rights was still being fiercely opposed by most men, including Frederick Seddon. The rest of the household consisted of Seddon's 73-year-old father and 4 children. There was also a servant named Mary Chater, a former mental nurse with a history of insanity in her family, who had the regrettable habit of throwing the crockery around whenever she had one of her turns. Apart from the somewhat hazardous business of going into the kitchen, when there was always the danger of being greeted by a piece of flying crockery, there would have been nothing particularly unusual about this household, had it not been for Frederick Seddon's character. A hard-working man who seems to have served his company with extraordinary zeal, he had one major fault. He was mean to an almost insane degree. His favourite occupation when at home was to count over his mounting store of gold coins, and to go over the accounts to see how much he could save on the housekeeping. It was this determination to save a few shillings where he could, which was to lead him to the gallows, when he might possibly have saved himself by spending a little more on the coffin for the woman he had poisoned. The story of Frederick Seddon's progress to the gallows begins when the family moved into 63 Tollington Park, London N4, which Seddon had bought for £350, after having beaten the owner down on the price. It was by no means a gracious house, being one of those solidly built early Victorian houses that needed someone with a little taste and money to improve it. Needless to say, neither was forthcoming from Seddon, who was too busy tossing up what the move had cost him to spend any money on the house. Being near to Holloway Prison, and in one of the more dreary streets in Finsbury Park, it was not exactly a coveted area in which to live. Whatever potentiality the house had inside was ruined by Seddon's parsimonious nature, with the result that the furniture he had put in it had been bought on the cheap, making the house look worse than it actually was. It was in this house, less than a mile from Hilldrop Crescent, where Crippen had disposed of his wife less than 3 years earlier, that another murder was about to take place. After turning one of the rooms into an office, for which he was given 5 shillings a week by his company, Seddon looked around for someone to take the unoccupied flat on the top floor. In the July of 1910, Miss Eliza Mary Barrow came in to see the flat and agreed to take it. When she moved in, she brought with her an engine driver named Robert Hooke and his wife, who had both lodged with her at the previous address. The 4th member of the party was a 6-year-old orphan boy named Ernie Grant, the nephew of Robert Hooke, whose mother had been Miss Barrow's landlady until her death in 1908. The fact that Miss Barrow had more or less adopted Ernie was the one good thing that could be said for her. His sister Hilda went into an orphanage. By all accounts, Miss Barrow was an unpleasant woman. She was 49 when she entered the Seddon household, when it soon became obvious to the Seddons that she was something of a drunken slut, whose favourite tipple was gin. She was a dirty and unkempt-looking woman, and was the very last person to have brought up the boy. Why she bothered to try and do so remains something of a mystery. Like Seddon, she was also obsessed with money, hoarding her collection of gold coins in a cash box rather than putting it in the safekeeping of a bank. The Hookes had hardly been in the house a week when Miss Barrow violently quarrelled with them and asked Seddon to order them to leave. Having already decided in that short space of time that Miss Barrow was a natural victim to be milked of everything he could get his hands on, Seddon was only too happy to send the Hookes packing, leaving him free to fleece Miss Barrow without anyone asking him awkward questions. Robert Hooke must have suspected what was in his mind, for his parting shot before they left was, "I will defy you and a regiment like you to get her money in your hands." He didn't know Seddon. Seddon watched them go, trailing behind the small van that was carrying their modest belongings to their new home. Then he went back into the house to work out how he was going to part Miss Barrow from her money. As she was no simple-minded and trusting spinster, but a belligerent and suspicious woman who trusted no one, Seddon knew that he was faced with a formidable task. It all proved much easier than Seddon had expected. Miss Barrow had a respect for her betters, and in many ways she saw Seddon as her social superior. He owned his own house, whereas Miss Barrow was only a tenant, and he had a well-paid job with a company he had worked for more than 20 years. As befitting his position as a superintendent for his company, he was always well turned out, so that he gave Miss Barrow the impression that she was dealing with an important city gent, rather than what he actually was, a twopenny, halfpenny insurance agent. But what appealed to her most about him was that he never talked down to her, treating her as an equal who understood everything he was saying whenever he rattled off figures relating to percentages and dividends. Miss Barrow was just beginning to congratulate herself on being fortunate enough to be living at 63 Tollington Park, where so much sensible advice on her affairs was available, when Seddon struck with all the speed of a rattlesnake going in for the kill. First there was the lease on the Buck's Head, a public house that Miss Barrow owned in Camden, which he persuaded her to hand over to him for an annual income of £52. Then he persuaded her that it would be in her interests to let him have £1,600 in India stock, in exchange for an annuity of £103 4 shillings 5 pence. At the time, both parties expressed themselves well satisfied with the deal. Shortly after, Miss Seddon gave birth to her 5th child, a baby girl she named Lily. It was probably after these 2 deals that Seddon began to contemplate doing away with Miss Barrow, thereby saving him having to pay her more than £150 a year. What finally decided him was something that Miss Barrow let slip out during one of their conversations. According to her, she owned nearly £4,000 in gold sovereigns and paper money, most of it kept in the house. Seddon's eyes watered with emotion as he thought of the money. "That's a great deal of money to keep in the house, my dear," he told Miss Barrow. "I think perhaps you should hand it over to me for safekeeping." Miss Barrow wasn't that stupid, and for the time being the idea of getting his hands on the money had to remain only a tantalizing dream for Seddon. In the meantime he consoled himself with the £216 that Miss Barrow drew from the bank and presumably handed over to him for another of his annuities, as the money was never seen again. Like so many Edwardian businessmen, Seddon was a great believer in the value of property, and it was about this time he decided to get rid of his India stock. He received nearly £1,520, and with most of the proceeds of the sale, he bought himself 14 leasehold houses in Cootes Road, Stepney. All of a sudden, he was very much a man of property, a role he enjoyed, and to which he was to make particular reference at his trial. From January 1911 until the August of that year, he refrained from killing Miss Barrow, for reasons which were not too difficult to establish. Ever since Miss Barrow had made it known to him that she had no wish to leave any money in her will to her relatives, Seddon had probably been angling for her to make a will in his favour, in exchange for a monthly payment until her death, which would then follow shortly afterwards. There was also the matter of the money Miss Barrow still had in the bank. When it became obvious that she had no intention of making a will out in his favour, there was still the possibility that she would make more withdrawals from the bank to add to the hoard she had in the house, which Seddon intended to steal the moment she was dead. By the August, it had become obvious that Miss Barrow was in no hurry to draw out any more money, and Seddon felt that he couldn't wait any longer. The time had now come for him to send her on her way. On the 5th of August, he took the whole family and Miss Barrow away for a weekend in Southend. As this was very much out of character in a man who never took more than one summer holiday a year, one can only assume that he wanted to get away for the weekend, to concentrate his mind on the unpleasant task that lay ahead. On their return home, Seddon sent his eldest daughter Maggie to the local chemist to buy some Mather's arsenical flypapers. These were the same type that Mrs. Maybrick was accused of using when she went on trial for the murder of her husband in 1889. On the morning of Friday, the 1st of September, Miss Barrow was chatting with Mrs. Seddon in the downstairs kitchen when she suddenly complained that she was feeling unwell. Mrs. Seddon helped her up to her bedroom, where she lay on the bed while Mrs. Seddon made her a cup of tea, which Miss Barrow was unable to keep down. Mrs. Seddon was not unduly alarmed, but as a precautionary measure, Dr. Swan, the family physician, was called in, and remained a regular visitor until her death on the 13th of September. With the laxity that seems to have been prevalent among general practitioners in those days, he did not bother to examine the body, having already diagnosed the cause of death as being from epidemic diarrhoea, though her symptoms could easily have been caused by arsenical poisoning. In this writer's opinion, Miss Barrow's initial attack was not the result of being poisoned by Seddon, as many writers who have dealt with this case have assumed, but have been brought about by Miss Barrow's complete indifference to the most elementary rules of hygiene. It had been a sweltering hot August, which had lasted up until the September, and Miss Barrow's flat had been infested with flies, which were forever settling on the food she had left out uncovered. To support this contention, Mrs. Seddon was later to assert that Miss Barrow had had similar attacks of this nature before, long before Seddon had even considered poisoning Miss Barrow for her money. What the first attack did do was to give Seddon the ideal opportunity to lace the liquid diet which Dr. Swan had advised, Valentine's meat juice, which he had prescribed, being particularly suitable for mixing with the arsenic that Seddon had extracted from the flypapers. During the period that Miss Barrow was alive, Seddon had been careful to keep out of her way, except on the one occasion when he had gone up to see her, and found her more concerned with her financial affairs than with the state of her health. She did say, however, that she wanted to make sure that young Ernie and Hilda should get everything if anything happened to her. "May I suggest you call in a solicitor?" Seddon had said. Miss Barrow had agreed, and a will was duly drawn up, making Seddon her sole executor. His duties as such included holding on to Miss Barrow's personal possessions and the furniture until Ernie and Hilda were of age, when he was to sell everything and hand over the proceeds to the two children. This was an added bonus for Seddon, who could now go through her effects at leisure and help himself to what he wanted. As Miss Barrow had not itemised her personal belongings, Seddon intended eventually to take the lot. After a woman had been in to lay out Miss Barrow, Seddon went along to see Mr. Nodes, the undertaker, and told him that he had only £4 10 to pay for the funeral. "For that sum the deceased will have to be buried in a public grave," the undertaker told him. "Then there's the matter of my commission for introducing the business," Seddon had the audacity to say. "Shall we say £3 17 6 to include everything?" Business was slack, and Mr. Nodes reluctantly shook hands on the deal. Understandably, as the late Miss Barrow's body was full of arsenic, Seddon was anxious to get her underground as soon as possible. "I want the deceased to be buried tomorrow afternoon," Seddon said. "That means you'll have to remove the body this evening." Mr. Nodes sighed. "If you insist, Mr. Seddon." Seddon had gone through Miss Barrow's effects in the morning, and had found 2 watches, a bracelet and some brooches. "There's not much here," Seddon told his wife and the charlady, whom Seddon had insisted should be present. "There will be very little for poor Ernie and Hilda." It was surprising there was anything, as Seddon had already stolen the gold coins and whatever cash there had been. Nearly 3 weeks after Miss Barrow had been buried, Seddon received a visit from Mr. and Mrs. Frank von der Ahe, Miss Barrow's nearest relatives. They were both in an angry mood, which was hardly surprising, as Seddon had omitted to inform them of Miss Barrow's death, and, to make matters worse, Seddon was away on holiday when they had found out about her demise 4 days after the funeral, and then, having returned from holiday, kept putting them off until he had finally agreed to this meeting. The interview was a stormy one, with Frank von der Ahe complaining bitterly that Miss Barrow had been buried in a public grave, when he would gladly have paid the difference for a decent burial had he but been informed. Seddon coldly told them that he had written, and had, moreover, kept a copy of the letter, which he produced. Whether Seddon actually posted the original letter is highly debatable. Seddon then began to discuss Miss Barrow's financial affairs. "According to my reckoning, you owe me £1 1 10½, Seddon said. "She left exactly £10 in cash. From this I have deducted the expense of the funeral and Ernie's keep." He produced a piece of paper from the drawer. "You'll find it all itemised here." Frank von der Ahe angrily pushed the piece of paper aside. "I know she kept a large amount of money in the house. What happened to it?" "There was nothing," Seddon said calmly. "Only the £10 and her personal possessions, which had been valued at £16. Incidentally, I'm quite prepared to bring up Ernie." What prompted him to offer to look after Ernie? Was his cold heart moved at last by the plight of poor adenoidal Ernie, whom he had deprived of the one person willing to bring him up? Perhaps he saw the boy as a living example of his kindness and generosity, to be pushed forward whenever someone accused him of being a skinflint. Or was it merely because the addition of one more to his family made very little difference to him in terms of hard cash, except for the cost of Ernie's clothing? Frank then asked Seddon a number of probing questions, which Seddon parried easily enough. "Everything has been done in a perfectly legal manner," he assured the Von der Ahes. He then produced a copy of the will, which Frank scanned through. "May we see the original of the will?" asked Frank. "You may not," Seddon retorted. "The only person who has the right to do that is your brother Percy, whom I believe disappeared some time ago." Why Seddon should have refused to show him the will is another puzzling factor in this case, especially as the copy had not been tampered with in any way. By refusing to show the will, which one could put down to Seddon being bloody-minded just for the sake of it, he merely increased the Von der Ahes' growing suspicions, which they wasted no time in communicating to the police after they had left. On the 15th of November, an order was issued to exhume the body, and Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, the pathologist, was called in to carry out the post-mortem, together with Dr. Wilcock, the senior analyst to the Home Office. Spilsbury had made his reputation with the case of Dr. Crippen, in which his evidence had played a large part in putting the hangman's noose around Crippen's neck. The Seddon case was to take him one step further up the ladder of fame, his reputation unassailable until as late as 1932, when his evidence at the trial of Mrs. Elvira Barney, accused of having shot a young lover, was torn to shreds by Sir Patrick Hastings. In this case, however, he was able to prove beyond question that Miss Barrow's death had been caused by arsenical poisoning. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Seddon on the 4th of December, and he was taken into custody outside his own home that evening. His only comments were, "Absurd! What a terrible charge! Wilful murder! It is the first of our family that has ever been charged with such a crime." On the 15th of January, Mrs. Seddon was also arrested, merely remarking, "Very well," when the police came for her. Why did the police arrest Mrs. Seddon, and on what evidence? There was none, beyond the fact that she had happened to buy some flypapers, and that she had cashed some cheques for Miss Barrow, and had used a false name when asked to sign for the money. However faintly suspicious this might seem in the telling, it hardly justified her being arrested, unless, of course, the police assumed that, as Seddon's wife, she had been privy to everything that had gone on in the house. The trial of Frederick Seddon and Mary Ann Seddon began in the Old Bailey on the morning of the 4th of March, 1912. All murder cases were highly dramatic affairs in those days, with a prisoner's very life depending on the outcome. This one, however, promised to be more dramatic than most, with Marshal Hall appearing for the defence, and the Attorney General Sir Rufus Isaacs appearing for the Crown. Both men already had formidable reputations, especially Marshal Hall, who treated the courtroom as a theatre in which he could display his love for the legal pyrotechnics, which were already beginning to make him a household name. Sir Rufus Isaacs, later to become Lord Reading, was a totally different character. Cool and incisive in the courtroom, his patrician features seldom showed anything like the emotion of Marshal Hall when facing the jurors. He was, nevertheless, a lethal prosecutor. In the courtroom, the spectators gazed at Seddon and wondered if he really was guilty as charged, as thousands of others had wondered in the past when they had gazed at the accused prisoner in the dock. The man they saw was bald-headed and sported a heavy moustache and looked unassuming enough, as Dr. Crippen had done in the dock. Unlike Crippen, though, Seddon's whole demeanour radiated an air of self-confidence and arrogance. It was this arrogance, coupled with his know-all attitude and his obvious contempt for everyone in the courtroom, which was to put the hangman's noose around his neck, more surely than any of the actual evidence produced against him. As for Mrs. Seddon, no one quite knew why she was standing in the dock, when it seemed obvious to everyone, almost from the beginning of the trial, that she was innocent. The battle that was to follow between Marshal Hall and Sir Rufus Isaacs was held before Mr. Justice Bucknell, whose uncontrollable tears before the court while delivering sentence on Frederick Seddon were to provide one of the more famous courtroom stories involving a judge. The fact that Miss Barrow died from arsenical poisoning was never in serious dispute. Once it had been established again for the benefit of the jurors, the question as far as Marshall Hall was concerned was not so much who administered the arsenic, but when it was taken and by what means. If he could establish that Miss Barrow had been ingesting the substance long before the Seddons were presumed to have poisoned her, there would be no case to answer, and the pair would be declared innocent. Marshall Hall was not at his very best at this trial, perhaps because he knew that Seddon's manner and basic personality could all too easily sabotage any points he made in the prisoner's favour. Even so, there were moments when he must have caused the jurors to wonder if the Seddons were not innocent after all. From the beginning, Marshall Hall tried to convince the jury that Miss Barrow was an arsenic eater, an addiction that was not uncommon in those days. To support his theory, he pointed out that a royal commission had already proven beyond doubt that arsenic was to be found in the roots of the hair of excessive beer drinkers. He was not suggesting that Miss Barrow was an excessive beer drinker, but that when arsenic was found in the roots of the hair, it was a clear indication that it had been in the body for a long time, as it took as much as 12 months to appear in the roots. Arsenic had been found in the roots of Miss Barrow's hair, thereby proving his point, he contended. This was an ingenious theory and might have carried some weight with the jury if Wilcock, the analyst who had helped Bernard Spilsbury at the exhumation, had not come up with the answer. While in her coffin, Miss Barrow's hair had become soaked with her own body fluids, which contained arsenic. Marshall Hall had to begin again, this time quoting the case of the Styrian peasants from Hungary who were addicted to arsenic eating with no noticeable ill effects, though arsenic existed in the body for years. Was it not possible, Marshall Hall argued, that this is what had happened to Miss Barrow? Was it not possible that what she had really died of was epidemic diarrhea, as had been stated on the death certificate? The jury was obviously unconvinced. Marshall Hall's strongest telling point came towards the end of the trial. Why, he thundered, didn't Seddon, were he guilty of poisoning Miss Barrow, have the body cremated? He would have had no difficulty at all, especially as he had been given a certificate of death from natural causes. A very good point, and one that Seddon must have wished he had thought of himself when making the funeral arrangements. The case against Mrs. Seddon was a weak one, as Mr. Gervase Rentoul, her defence counsel, and even the judge himself pointed out to the jury. It was based on 2 pieces of evidence that might or might not have proved that she was Seddon's willing accomplice. She was known to have cashed some of Miss Barrow's £5 notes for gold at various places, and signed for them with the false name and address of M. Scott of Evershot Road, and on one occasion she had bought some fly papers which she had put to soak in Miss Barrow's room, to keep away the flies. When questioned about the false name and address she had given, Mrs. Seddon said, "Because the notes did not belong to me." "Then why did you not give Miss Barrow's name?" she was asked. "Because I had no right to sign Miss Barrow's name." This rather baffling piece of confused morality was accepted merely as an example of Mrs. Seddon's disarming frankness, and before she left the stand it was obvious she was going to be acquitted. With Seddon, it was a very different matter. There was no definite evidence against him to indicate that he had poisoned Miss Barrow, so the case against him was a purely circumstantial one. It was true that he was the only person to benefit from the death of Miss Barrow, but would a man in his position really murder for the amount of money involved? Seddon himself was to write after his trial, "There was no motive for me to commit such a crime. I would have to be a greedy, inhuman monster, or to be suffering from a degenerate or deranged mind, as I was in good financial circumstances. 21 years in the same employ, a good position, a good home with every comfort, a wife, 5 children and an aged father, 73 depending on me. My income just on £50 a week." The rest of the letter set out to prove that by murdering Miss Barrow, he would have been gaining only 26 shillings a week. The case for the Crown was based on the seemingly unlikely premise that Seddon had murdered for so little. Having established the motive and the opportunity to commit the murder, the Attorney General called no less than 45 witnesses, who all spoke with horror and incredulity of Seddon's incredible greed for money. In all the examples of Seddon's greed and meanness that were made known to the court, none was more damning than the undertaker's account of how Seddon had haggled over the price of the burial, and extracted a trifling commission from him, while arranging for Miss Barrow to be buried in a pauper's grave. From all their accounts of Seddon, the jurors were able to build up a picture of a ruthless and greedy man who was so pathologically obsessed with money that he was obviously capable of murder if it meant putting a few extra shillings in his pocket. The jury was out for exactly an hour before they returned with their verdict. Mrs. Seddon was found not guilty and acquitted, while Seddon was found guilty as charged. Seddon leaned over and kissed his wife when he heard that she had been declared innocent, and then turned to face the judge while she was led away in tears. When asked if he had anything to say before sentence of death was passed on him, Seddon made a long speech in which he protested his innocence. He then gave the judge a Masonic sign while saying, "I declare before the great architect of the universe, I am not guilty, my lord." This appeal for clemency from one Freemason to another had a marked effect on the judge, who answered Seddon in a faltering voice that became charged with emotion when he made an indirect reference to Seddon's use of the Masonic sign. "You and I know we belong to the same brotherhood, but our brotherhood does not encourage crime. On the contrary, it condemns it. I pray you make your peace with the great architect of the universe." He was in tears when he ordered Seddon to be taken to a place of execution and hanged by the neck until he was dead. Seddon was hanged on the 28th of April 1912. Instead of sinking into obscurity as the shamed wife of the executed poisoner, Mrs. Seddon bounced back into the headlines 3 times, the first time being when she remarried within weeks of her husband's execution. The next occasion was when she said in a confession in the Weekly Dispatch that she had seen Seddon poison Miss Barrow, but had kept silent because he had threatened her with a revolver. The third occasion was when she admitted in an article in John Bull that her confession for the Dispatch was a farrago of nonsense, which she had concocted purely because she needed the money. As for poor Ernie and Hilda, it is to be hoped that life was kinder to them in the future than it had been in the past. But perhaps the last words in this case belonged to Seddon, who remained true to his nature to the very last. Just before his death, he was informed that his house had just been sold for less than its market value. "That's finished it," he groaned. He must be the only murderer in history who went to the gallows more concerned with the poor price his property had fetched than with his impending doom. A very fine cook. Tillie Gburek, USA, 1921. Like all large cities, Chicago had its ethnic communities, who lived, worked, and died in one of the run-down areas of the city. Life was not easy in these ghettos, which had sprung up after America had first opened her doors around 1848 to receive the great flood of refugees from Europe. They had come with high hopes of finding a rewarding new life in the States, merely to find themselves only marginally better off than they had been in the old country. The quarter known in Chicago as Little Poland was no better or worse than any of the other sections of the city where the refugees had made their homes, except that most of the small businesses in Little Poland were given over to the rag trade, an industry in those days where women slaved from dawn to dusk, producing garments for the lower end of the market. For most of the women who worked in these factories, the only way of escaping was to get married through one of the marriage brokers operating in the area. Generally, if they were young and attractive, the marriage broker was able to find them a husband, whereupon the bride exchanged the serfdom of the sewing machine for that of the kitchen. Tillie Gburek was young, but not by any stretch of the imagination could she be called pretty. In fact, it would not be unfair to say she looked more like a stevedore in drag than a woman in the full bloom of youth. In all other respects, Tillie was a normal, full-blooded woman, and it was therefore only natural that she should think of finding herself a husband. As was the custom in Little Poland, she went to see one of the marriage brokers in the neighborhood. "So you want to find yourself a husband, my dear," the broker said. She looked at Tillie as she sat there in her shapeless sweater, with muscular arms akimbo, her peasant-like face flushed with expectation. Being a woman who disliked turning away business, she nailed an encouraging smile on her lips. "I'm sure I can do something for you. That'll be $50, please." The prospective husband the broker came up with was John Mitkevich, a man who was far more interested in finding himself a good cook, rather than some flighty and unreliable, sexy-looking girl who was liable to stray. As it happened, Tillie Gburek was the ideal partner, for if there was one thing she could do well, it was to cook a good meal. The happy couple were united in 1886, and though it could hardly be called the marriage of the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?